all over London, and especially in the heartland, in the city, in Coleman Street, in St Stephen's Ward, there were illegal presses run by William Larner, who was to be a leveller, by Richard Overton, who was a key figure in the leveller movement. And this was a dangerous business. The Stationers' Company, one of those great companies that I talked about, the Stationers' Company were the only people legally allowed to print. And if you printed outside the monopoly of the Stationers' Company had agents, essentially their own private police force, who would hunt you down, smash up your press, seize your pamphlets, and throw you in prison. So the whole of the movement, the radical movement, especially the levellers, were masters of illegal printing. There's an absolutely brilliant story of William Larner moving his press. He was being searched for by the Stationers' Beagles, as they call it. And he moves his press from Bishopsgate, just out to where Aldgate is now, which was open field at the time. And there's a brilliant complaint by Joseph Hunscott, who was one of the Stationers' agents. So they arrive at the front door of Larner's new printing, where Larner's new press is. They're hammering in the door, the printers are holding the door, they manage to break in, and then they run upstairs and they found there's a rope out the bedroom window and all the printers have dropped down into the field and run off. And they never get them on that occasion, although on many occasions they did. So, gathered churches, religious radicalism, illegal printing and pamphlet production, this is the core of what drives the English Revolution, especially in London. Lilburn, at one very famous meeting in Wapping, says, tomorrow we're going to have 30,000 copies of a petition printed. Now, 30,000 copies. This is in a country that has a population of 5 million. In a London that has a population of 350,000. 30,000, that's a decent print run now. It's a decent number of people signing a petition now in a country with 60 million. Think what that meant to be able to sign that. One of the level petitions had 100,000 signatures on it, reported. Now maybe some of these figures are exaggerated, but it's absolutely clear they were able to petition and to mobilise on a very, very wide scale indeed, because not only did they petition, but then they gathered crowds to present the petition at Westminster. And Lilburn was, right in the early days of the Revolution, involved in physical fighting with the Royalists in Westminster Hall. There's a great story of a running fight where some more extreme courtiers and officers around the king, it's the first time where the term roundhead is used because of the haircut of the apprentices, the cropped hair of the apprentices. And there's a running fight where Lilburn and others draw their swords and they're fighting up and down Westminster Hall. And only the arrival of more apprentices from the city who start to pull up the tiles from the floor of Westminster Hall and throw them at the Royalists, they managed to beat them off. So there's a huge, now in the course of the 1640s, a huge process of radicalisation, popular mobilisation, petitioning, illegal printing, gathered churches, which is what drives the whole of the revolution forward. And the Levellers were the best organised people at this. And when the New Model Army, which was towards the end of the Civil War, the Parliament decided it's got to completely remodel its army. That's where the name comes from. They have to reshape their army because it's not being effective. It's too leisurely. It's too deferential to the king. And you have to remember, even when the Civil War broke out, the Parliamentary army would go into battle with, on their flags, you can still see them, on their flags it would say, "For King and Parliament." Even though they were fighting the king on the battlefield, the slogan was still, we're not, it was like armed negotiation. We aren't trying to militarily defeat the king, we're just trying to force him to come to a more reasonable settlement with us. And that mentality worked all the way through most of the Civil War. The Earl of Manchester was the commander of the most effective part of the parliamentary army, said, if we beat the king 99 times out of 100, he will still be the king, and we will be ruined. But if we beat him just once, that's all that's necessary. And that's that debate about whether or not we're in armed negotiation or actually trying to defeat the Royalists, that was driven forward by the rank and file of the New Model Army, by Oliver Cromwell, who was the sort of most prominent spokesperson of the war party, of the win the war party, as opposed to win the war for a negotiated peace party. And John Lilburn and the Levellers in the rank and file of the army were the people who were pushing that debate forward. And they were crucial to that. There wouldn't have been a revolution at the end of the day. There wouldn't have been a final defeat of the king without that radical push. Even the most radical of the officers, even Cromwell, hesitated at the last moment about whether or not to bring the king to trial. And of course, like all revolutions, you can't stop it halfway. If they hadn't brought the king to trial, the king, moderates on the parliamentary side, were inviting him back to London. This was even after a second civil war, to come to a negotiated peace and retake the throne, to be re-enthroned as one regiment of the New Model Army petitioned. So we have to stop the re-enthroning of the king, because if the king gets back on the throne, then we're all dead men. And that balance, when the English Revolution hung in the balance between committing the king for trial or having him re-enthroned with a personal treaty, as it was called, when that moment came, even the most radical of the mainstream officers of the New Model Army hesitated, and it was a huge petitioning campaign by the Levellers, the so-called large petition, which meant comprehensive, not it was a big thing, but it was a comprehensive petition, which enshrined many of the things that they said the previous year in a document called the Agreement of the People, which was the first time there had ever been a written constitution suggested for any state. And we still haven't got one in this country, but it was first proposed at least here. And that petitioning campaign in the army and in London forced the hand of the more conservative, even of the radical officers, and pushed them down the road of bringing the king to trial. Without that political campaign and without the element of the Levellers being involved in it, the whole English Revolution might well have had a very, very different, a counter-revolutionary outcome, not a revolutionary outcome. Now, as I've said at the beginning, that whole thing was if you think about that, going from 1640 or the late 1630s when Lilburne's first arrested and beaten, all the way through two civil wars, all the way through the radicalisation of the army, all the way through that petitioning and demonstrating, and there were hundreds and hundreds of petitions, hundreds and hundreds of pamphlets. One bookseller called George Thomason, who had a shop by St Paul's, where lots of the booksellers and printers were, collected every pamphlet he could. He collected every pamphlet that came out in London, and he probably only had a portion of them. And they still exist. The Thomason tracts are the single biggest collection of pamphlets that we have from the English Revolution. They're in the British Library to this day. There's one right on the English Revolution. This is where you go to look at. There are 20,000 of them that just one bookseller collected in a space of 8 or 9 years. So that's what drove the revolution forward. But at its peak, at the end, when the Republic came and the king was executed, first Republic ever, like achieved through a revolutionary means, there was a division. The Levellers wanted more democracy, and other people wanted even more than that. And that's where the Diggers came from. The king was executed at the end of January 1649, and almost at the same time, St George's Hill was dug up by Gerald Stanley, and in Wellingborough and other places, the Digger movement began. And it was partly a kind of brilliant spark shooting forward from that whole 10-year period of debate and argument, which then began to question not just whether or not we want democracy, not just whether we want a republic, but whether we want some change in the economic structure of the society as well. The Levellers never addressed that question. The Levellers were Democrats. They wanted a democratic society, and they wanted political democracy, but they never raised the question of who owned the land or who owned the economy in any sense. Gerald Stanley did do that, and the Levellers did do that. The true Levellers, as they were called, did do that. That was a brilliant spark, but they were a minority of a minority of a minority. The parliamentarians, the middling sort, the Puritans, were a minority of society. The Levellers were a minority of that minority, and the Diggers and the Ranters and the Fifth Monarchists were a minority even smaller than that. So we shouldn't think that they could have realised on a sort of society-wide scale what they wanted, but they did pose a question. They did pose an issue right at the heart of the English Revolution. When the Levellers and others were debating in Putney Church with the leaders of the New Model Army about the Agreement of the People in 1647, Thomas Rainsborough, the most senior he's colonel in the New Model Army and a Leveller supporter. He said that he was arguing for democracy because he said, the poorest he that is in England hath a life to live as the richest he. And I see no reason why any man should put himself under a government that he hath not had a hand in choosing. And when Henry Ireton, who was Cromwell's son-in-law, replied in that debate, he said, all that I say, all that I'm going to say against you, in other words, all that I say is because I have an eye to property. That what you are saying will tend to anarchy. Cromwell said, if you give people the vote, they will use the vote, the poor will use the vote to take the wealth from the rich. And that's why their enemies called them levellers, and why the levellers always said, on their pamphlet it says levellers, underneath in brackets, falsely so called. Because they rejected the idea that they were actually a threat to private property, when what they were actually only arguing for was political democracy. But the Diggers, right at the final moment of the English Revolution, at its final moment of triumph, a minority of people addressed the property question that Ireton raised by saying, yes, actually, you're right, we would take away your property, which was something that the Levellers had to say. Now, often, I'll end here, something went on too long. Often I think there's a falsely polarised debate about what we take from the English Revolution. And it's a mistake, I think, to think that we should counterpose what the Levellers, or even what Cromwell did, because Cromwell was a decisive force at a certain point when he was the leader of the Win the War party. The revolution would have halted there had he not been able to win an argument that the war should be fought through to its finish, and after all, he did as much as anybody on the battlefield to make sure that it did. The whole English Revolution, in other words, is our inheritance, from Cromwell to the Levellers to Winstanley. And the whole of it is our inheritance, because it only happens when you have a modern working class, that you have an agency, you have a class in society with the organisational capacity to both win a war against the new ruling class, to insist on a more fully democratic system, and to insist even further that only a system which gives you control over the economy can in any way be called a democracy. I mean, one short definition of the word socialism is democracy extended from the political realm to the realm of the economy. After all, many of the most important decisions in our lives, whether you have a job or you don't have a job, how much you're paid for a job, what you produce, how hard you work, what you'll pay for it when it reappears on the supermarket shelves, those are economic decisions which are taken by a corporate aristocracy, every bit as unaccountable as Charles I and his aristocrats. What modern socialism is the idea of democracy extended to the idea of control over the economy. But the whole of that experience in the English Revolution in the 1640s, of revolutionary mobilisation, of organisation, of democracy and of economic control, that's the inheritance of the modern socialist movement.
When you're talking about the revolution being pushed forward by the Minister, and they represented the merchant class, as it were, maybe you could argue that the revolution led to the start of modern capitalism, because they were the class that actually came through and were the ultimate winners.
I just wanted to clarify how much this was basically a London movement, and how London was different from the rest of England. But linked to that, how the Diggers nevertheless managed to set up communes in outside London.
I was wondering, how do you try a king for treason?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. What those people were doing, in fact, if you look at it in socially and economically rather than politically, what they were doing was opening the way for modern capitalism. And as soon as the revolution was successful, a number of absolutely amazing things happened. The Bank of England's formed, the Royal Society's formed, the whole rush towards a modern capitalist society accelerates at that point. And in some ways, a short a short answer to why was the English Revolution necessary, the short answer is because the aristocratic and kingly rule was getting in the way of the forward march of the middling sort and trade and merchants. What's interesting is that in order to win against the king, they have to mobilise people. You know, if they could have done it on their own, they would have done it on their own, but they couldn't. They were too tied in themselves, actually, partly to the whole structure. So with the City of London and its corporations, there's a kind of antagonistic, but also dependent relationship between the Crown and, because the Crown's a massive market for the traders. So they themselves want this to happen, but don't have the radicalism and the social force to make it happen. So they begin to appeal in universalist terms. They don't say, look guys, we really want to be a lot richer than we are, and these guys are in our way, so would you mind just giving us a hand? No, they say, we want democracy, we all need democracy, don't we guys? Yeah, right, let's bang them out of the way. So they have to make an appeal to people who don't have the same economic interests as they do, but to appeal to them in universalist terms. We want democracy, we want religious freedom, we want to beat the Catholics, whatever. And that process makes the revolution, but then the moment where it breaks apart into who's going to gain, the moment where diggers start saying, hang on a minute, why don't we have any land here? That's the moment where that alliance breaks up, and then different political questions, which are questions which then roll down the ages still to us, they begin to come into play at that point. London, London was an even bigger part of the English economy and English society than it is today. Everybody, nearly all the radicals, let's see, William Warwick, Leveller, born in Worcestershire, comes to London to be apprenticed to trade. Gerald Winstanley comes to London to be apprenticed to trade. John Lilburn, born family in Newcastle, comes to London to be apprenticed to trade. It's a massive magnet, bringing especially the middling sort into a huge trading megapolis, which doesn't exist in any other part of the country. So there's a very strong sense in which, yes, it is a London movement, and politically, the key events are settled in London, even though the battlefields are all over the country. Furthermore, it's the centre of the southeast, and if you want to draw a line, say from York to Plymouth, south and east of that line is more or less parliamentary territory. North and west of that line is more or less royalist territory. South and east of that line is more prosperous. North and west of that line is poorer, more feudal, more agricultural, more still dominated by the old aristocracy. That's how that worked out. But I would say this. We know more about the diggers in other places because they started digging the land. So there's a thing that's happening that you get reported. It's harder to see where a Lilburn pamphlet ended up. And so it's hard to see the Levellers as a political organisation, although when I've been looking at this, you do begin to hear it. You hear of them of people distributing Leveller pamphlets, mainly because, you know, lots of people have never been outside their parish. But you join the New Model Army, you're fighting everywhere from Cornwall to Berwick, to Dunbar, to Worcester, to Wales. And with them, they're taking radical preachers and radical pamphlets and distributing them. So you catch this every now and again of the distribution networks of the pamphlets around. So partly, yes, London was very, very central, very, very much dominant economically and politically, but also there's gaps in the historical record, which are fewer of them in London and more of them elsewhere. The king, this was that question. That was exactly the question at the time. And if you think about it, it's an enormously radical thing to do in itself, because as you say, the normal thing is, who's the head? The king? Anybody who disobeys the king is committing treason. And one of the enormous sort of ideological upheavals was to say, actually, guys, there's something bigger than the king. There is the people of this country. And even a king can commit treason against what is actually the supreme power of this country, which is the people of this country. And as the Civil War supremus lex, the Latin tag, which means the supreme law is the safety of the people. And the safety of the people, if you remember, became a huge thing in the French Revolution. The radical Jacobin committee was called the Committee of Public Safety. So Salus Populi Supremus Lex, the safety of the people is the highest law. And it started appearing on the battle flags of the Rainsborough brothers. Thomas Rainsborough, Pope's brother William Rainsborough was a leveller, and his battle flag later on had the disembodied head of the king on it with the slogan Salus Populi Supremus Lex around it. And so they entirely subverted and reversed the normal thing. Normally, the king has subjects, and they said no. The people are the supreme law, and even the king is subordinate to the supreme law.